Hello, my friend. Today's Thursday, August 27th, 2026. It's quite late in the evening. If you're brand new to this channel, consider subscribing. We do speak quite a bit about Keel Infrastructure. And one of the ways we're going to start comparing Keel Infrastructure to other companies is through charts. And so there should be a chart that's showing up somewhere on the screen as I speak. This is something that I had to kind of create by hand using some scripting languages and a couple of other innovations to see if I could put together a chart that basically just captures a 3-month window in time. Now you might say to yourself, hey, why 3 months instead of 30 months or maybe even longer? And I thought, 3 months is just enough to give us a little bit of a peek into the rearview mirror without really getting bogged down with history that's behind us. Remember, those of us who are invested in shares of Keel Infrastructure are most interested in what is going to happen next, not necessarily what has happened in the past. But nevertheless, I do think this is somewhat useful. When looking at the chart for Keel, and you can see this on your screen, I was confused at one point because I was experimenting with TeraWulf as well. And I got a bit mixed up as to which chart belonged to which company, because to my amazement, the actual chart pattern was practically identical, which kind of raised the question, my gosh, we're invested in Keel Infrastructure, but could we just as easily be invested in TeraWulf or perhaps a couple of other different companies within this sector whose stock price performance and chart pattern looks practically identical to that of Keel Infrastructure? It's kind of thought-provoking, and we'll definitely get into this a little bit more, little by little. I wanted to emphasize, however, that looking at the chart, it really does clearly seem to me, at least, as if though we are certainly in something of a downtrend. Hopefully that's a downtrend that's going to start to reverse. In fact, even though there's a bit of a downtrend, I think there's been some bullish movement to the upside, and the MACD numbers that I'm going to start deciphering and kind of explaining what all this is, especially if you're not really into certain technical indicators, that's fine. We're going to go over everything. But basically, I'm focusing on something called the Relative Strength Index, something called the MACD, and I'll get into the full name of that in due course, as well as basically looking at a volume indicator to try to get a better sense of, hey, what kind of volume has been accompanying some of the price moves that we're seeing. So, hey, look, at the end of the day, charts are not going to tell us what's going to happen next. Okay, at best, they're letting us know what has happened in the past, which is of absolutely, I think, zero value if you're a long-term investor in shares of Keel Infrastructure or any other company, and you're not really that focused on what tomorrow's stock price will be, but instead more interested in what the stock price might be, a couple of years from now. Make sense? That being said, though, I also acknowledge that it is kind of fun and it is kind of interesting and it can be entertaining to take a look at the chart pattern, kind of get a sense of where we've been, and I think make a reasonable, logical, sort of like sober, assessment of where the indicators seem to suggest we are at the moment and what that could portend for the near future. Again, it's a bit of a fool's errand, right? You and I both understand this, right? We're smart enough to know that you can look at a bazillion charts and you're not going to really be able to accurately predict what tomorrow's stock price is going to be. Make sense? But nevertheless, I do think it is useful and interesting and entertaining, as I said a moment ago, to at least look at this as a way to compare ourselves, right? To compare shares of Keel Infrastructure and their performance to a couple of other companies, right, in our peer group and beyond. So, with all of that said, today was a reasonably decent day, okay? No complaints. I took a look. Hey, no official news releases from the company. I didn't see any updates to their X account. I certainly didn't see anything in terms of like filings or press releases, as I alluded to a moment ago. So really today, a bit of a no news day. So I took the opportunity to kind of dive in, do a little bit of programming, try to figure out a way to visually depict some of this data so that hopefully what we can do is say, all right, let's take a look at Keel. Let's take a look at TeraWulf. Let's take a look at Cipher Digital. Let's take a look at Brad platforms. And let's kind of visually be able to see how shares of Keel are doing, right? At least insofar as a 3-month look back window compared to some of these other companies. Does that make sense? I know that I've mentioned a desire to do more of this sort of thing, but it occurred to me it's kind of difficult sometimes, right? Without getting into the minutia of, okay, guys, let's turn to page 70, 72 of, TeraWolf's recent 10Q filing, and let's kind of dive into some footnotes. I mean, that I think there's a point where that's maybe interesting, but to just kind of do this in a much more efficient, interesting way, I think looking at a chart kind of does the job, right? And looking at some of the technical indicators that we could apply consistently across all these different companies, and then maybe drawing some conclusions as to how Keel Infrastructure is doing as compared to some, or if not all, of its peers. Bearing in mind, of course, that Keel Infrastructure does have a benchmark now, right? The Russell 3000. So I do think it's useful from time to time, as I alluded to recently, to kind of circle back, take a look at how the Russell 3000 is doing, and then I think appropriately compare Keel's share price performance to that index, of which, may I remind you, Keel Infrastructure is now a part. Okay, my friends, with all of that said, I hope you've had a lovely day. Tomorrow's Friday. Let's do a roundup of how, I think we were calling it the Incredible Seven, right? A number of companies that are basically peers to Keel Infrastructure. Let's see how they did for the past week. And, with any luck, the movements that we're starting to see in shares of Keel Infrastructure, maybe we can pick up some more momentum. Maybe next week brings some positive news. But if not, there's always going to be the week after that, and then the week after that, and then the week after that. I've been at this now for what feels like years. It's literally years. I'm very patient. But hey, it's fun and interesting to fill the time by sometimes zooming in on some of the more near-term price action and making some interesting comparisons to other companies, right? It's part about having fun along the journey. Otherwise, it's kind of like watching paint dry. Not a whole lot of fun. Okay, my friends, let's stay positive. Let's be great. Consider subscribing to this channel if you're brand new. We do speak quite a bit about Keel Infrastructure, and we will see each other again tomorrow.